Good morning and welcome to the Ministry of Housing, a digital workshop series empowering houses of worship to understand the real estate development process. Join us each week, starting, a couple weeks ago, and focusing today on the financing piece. Now, if you do miss any of our programs, you're welcome to watch the series on our YouTube channel, which is /SF Interfaith Council. This program is a partnership between the San Francisco Interfaith Council and DCG Strategies. Today's program, the financing piece, will feature consultant Lisa Motoyama, who offers a presentation on Financing 101, establishing the basics of housing development financing. And we welcome VP Caroline McCormack, who will provide case studies for accessing various loan products and financial resources made available by the city. A special thanks, the Ministry of Housing Workshop Series is supported by a grant from the San Francisco Foundation. A bit of housekeeping, today's program is being recorded. For audio and video, participants are muted and without video to minimize distraction. You can chat, so submit a question or comment by selecting the chat button at the bottom of your screen and sending a message to Q&A. Questions will be forwarded to the host and answered, time permitting. For closed captions, select the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and click Enable Live Transcription. And at this time, I would like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trey. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, and on behalf of the SFIC and our collaborating partner, DCG Strategies, I want to welcome you to this third segment in a 6-week online series entitled The Ministry of Housing. This series, as was mentioned, is made possible by a generous grant from the San Francisco Foundation. According to San Francisco Planning Department records, there are 800 properties in our city owned by religious entities, many of which are underutilized and whose faith communities are struggling financially. At a time when San Francisco is in dire need of more and affordable housing, the leadership of these entities also recognize the moral obligation to be responsible stewards of their properties in order to provide for the greater good. In response to these needs, at the height of the tech boom and soaring real estate prices, the most prominent faith leaders in San Francisco gathered and formed the Interfaith Essential Housing Task Force. Collaborating with and drawing upon the generous wisdom of DCG Strategies, this task force seeks to achieve its vision of helping its diverse constituencies transform their real estate assets so that those properties may realize their potential and help provide the sorely needed housing for San Franciscans who otherwise could not afford to live here and thus would be forced to relocate. Building upon the highly successful recent in-person workshop of the same name, this series is designed to cast a wider net in assisting and supporting congregations and religious institutions contemplating developing their properties for affordable housing. Realizing that developing property in a city like ours can be daunting and is not the primary field of expertise for congregation leaders, it is our hope that the curriculum being offered in this series will provide the unique opportunity for attendees to learn from leading industry experts, including architects, affordable housing finance specialists, developers, attorneys, and the San Francisco Department of Planning. Explore public and private funding solutions to support development and learn ways to partner with real estate professionals to reach their goals. Thank you for taking the time to join us in what promises to be an invaluable learning opportunity. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce friend and valued colleague, Landis Graden, founder and principal of DCG Strategies. Landis, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Michael. Thank you for that introduction. And as I've said the last 2 weeks, I just am grateful for your leadership in this effort. You've stayed this course for many years. We've been doing this for almost a decade, and the task has been to help the local houses of worship become empowered in this process. They recognize they have valuable real estate. What they've lacked is the ability to navigate and successfully be empowered on the other end and see what their desired outcomes are realized versus, getting lost in the process. And so I just wanted to say thanks for your leadership and all these years, and for the vision to bring this online to make it accessible to folks, because and to live where they can go back and review. So this is just critical information. And I just want to say good morning, everyone. Good to see you this morning online. And for those of you who've been with us this journey, this is our third installment. If you're just plugging in, I highly recommend you go back and look at the prior 2 installments. What we are endeavoring to do is to demonstrate for faith communities how to walk down this path of developing housing at your respective sites. And the format is very specific. So this is not a haphazard format. We specifically have organized the content in sequence. And it's the sequence that we believe that you should also follow, that allows you to develop such a foundation as you go forward in the ministry of housing. And just to take a moment and just kind of provide some context and level set. What we encourage you to do is, before you sign away property rights or enter into a development agreement, is that you do some basic primary learnings first, so that you are empowered first and foremost in any transaction that you engage in. And then you understand what the risks and also the desired outcomes are in advance. Whereas not knowing this information, you could find yourself on the other side of maybe some undesirable circumstances or some unintended consequences for just not knowing how to navigate this process. And so we also encourage you to have someone at on your team early on that could represent you in this journey. So our company, DCG Strategies, the role we often play is owner rep. So it's a function that allows the ministry itself to participate with the full knowledge and understanding of all the other partners who are going to join. And then you enter into the relationship with a position of leverage, a position of strength, and a position of understanding, so that you can get to your desired outcomes. And so week 1, we covered is there. That basically means, does your land itself have the legal capacity, the legal ordinances, if you will, legally to build housing? Does it physically support housing on your site? And then internally, are you aligned organizationally to take on this journey? And so, assuming that your site is developable, assuming that the local jurisdiction, and we're focusing on San Francisco, says, yes, we think you can develop housing on that site, the zoning is already there, or there's a pathway to get there, and that internally, organizationally, you are aligned. So whether it's the local body that's making this decision, if you have a higher regional governance structure where you need different permissions, all that is in line, then you're ready to move forward in your housing journey, in our opinion. And then the week 2 was, we brought in an architect, because that's where the journey really then starts taking life. That's where you start getting into the programmatic opportunity. How many units? What could these units look like? You get into the capacity of the site, you get into some high level programming decisions. Should we be senior housing or family housing or special needs housing? So that's the second thing that takes place. So after you've done your internal alignment and verified that your site can support development, you've engaged an architect so that you have a good understanding of what your site is able to produce. The next thing we recommend is today's conversations, look at your numbers. We want you to be empowered to understand where the sources for construction financing will come from, and then how that money is used during construction, sources and uses, so that you know how it pencils. Pencils is another way to say, is it financially feasible? We don't want you learning that from your developer partner after you've already committed, because you may have already heard the stories of, oh, the project stalled because there's not enough money, or we didn't really understand that we weren't going to get any financial resources from this. So we want you to be empowered and understand the different ways that you can participate financially, or at minimum, just understand how the project comes together financially. So we brought in two fantastic experts that are going to walk us through the world of nonprofit affordable housing finance. A lot of the principles also apply to workforce housing as well. So just keep that in mind. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa and Caroline to walk us through their journey on what you should be thinking about when it comes to how does this project finance.
Thank you and good morning. I'm going to share some slides. So my name is Lisa Motoyama. I'm with Community Economics. We're a nonprofit technical assistance provider. We do affordable housing finance, and we've done that for about a little over 40 years. So get my next slide. So the affordable housing finance, really what we're starting with is what Landis mentioned, is does it pencil? And that means feasibility analysis. So you talked amongst yourselves, you looked at it, the site with your architect, you decide who you want to serve and what it might look like. So part of the financing analysis is to say, is there funding for that? And in addition to what you might typically think of just loan financing, there are funding sources from local government, state, and federal sources that would be really important to make sure that your development can move forward. So we use a term called a financial pro forma. That's very important. A pro forma is a model. So we're building a model in numbers of what your project could look like and what it could do. So a model, we look at what sources you have, what will cost, your uses, how many units you have, what income levels you'll be serving, any special populations, and then how will this project function over time, which is your cash flow. So those are your pieces that go into a pro forma model. So sometimes when I start talking about pro formas and models and numbers, people kind of glaze over. But this is really just fancy words to say, who do you serve? How much money do you have? What does it cost? And how will it operate over the long term? So if you keep those 4 questions in mind, when you look at any numbers for your project, you will be able to drill down into what's important. So when we do a pro forma, when we create this model, we're really talking about some basic rules of thumb. And that's called underwriting. And I'm sure Caroline will go into like more fancy descriptions of what underwriting really means. But for my purpose, underwriting is just taking really standard assumptions that everybody agrees on that are useful for understanding whether your project is feasible. And the underwriting tells us how much risk you have or how much risk you don't have. So when you're starting to frame your project, this is a typical example, and I'm using Sonoma because that's what we use in my office. Your first question is, who do you want to serve, right? You're looking at the incomes of the people you want to serve, what kind of, jobs they might have. So if you're looking at workforce, you're looking at certain people in certain kinds of jobs. If you're looking at seniors, you're looking at people that may be on fixed income. So you want to make sure that when you are deciding who you're serving, that the rents match that population. So we go through a lot of very complicated calculations to get to what is the right rents for your population. We look at income levels, and all this information is available on the website for the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. We use federal income levels, the area median income that's set by the federal government at the county level to determine what is affordable. So rents are considered affordable if you're paying 30% of your income for rent and utilities. So that will tell you whether or not your rent is affordable to that income. So what we consider to be low-income housing is 60% of the area median income and below. Very low income is considered 50% of area median income and below. And extremely low income is considered 30% of area median in income and below. So you can establish pretty quickly by using these standard income levels who you can serve and how low income you can reach. Okay, so rents are also calculated based on those income levels for you at the tax credit website. And you can we use these standard rents. So we're not saying, you know, you make a certain income and you make a certain income and sort of taking a rent based on that. We use these standard rent levels based on this area median income. So that means the area median income is what the very middle of folks in the county make. And from there, we take those percentages that tell us what low income, very low income, and extremely low income are. And you might be surprised, which in the Bay Area, that median income is still pretty high, but 30% of that is still considered extremely low income, where in other counties, other states, that might be more closer to the median. So once you have your rents established, you can tell how much income your project will generate. So once you have that, then you can look at how much it will cost to operate. So your operating budget will take into account all the things that you need to pay for in order to operate your property. There's a property management company that will have a fee. There's some administrative costs, maintenance costs, utilities. And these are not the utilities paid by the residents, but they're for things like your heating in your office, lighting in the hallways. So common area utilities. Insurance is a very important cost. As some of you may know, insurance costs have been going up extremely quickly. And so that's a very important factor in what it costs to operate a building. Taxes and assessments, if you have services, resident services, activities coordinators, those kinds of things, that has a cost. And your property management staff and maintenance staff, janitorial staff, they have costs, they have, you know, benefits, payroll tax, workers' compensation fees. So all that goes in and you come up with an operating expense. If you have rental subsidies that are, you know, they are Section 8. So project-based Section 8 can be a funding source. Tenant-based Section 8 is not a funding source. So you would have to work with your housing authority to see if you would be eligible for any rental subsidies. So once you know how much income you have from your rents, any miscellaneous income for things like vending machines and laundry, you subtract what is known as a vacancy allowance, which is typically 5%. Now you might say, well, if you have a building and it's serving very low income people and your rents are very low, you would expect your building to be 100% occupied all the time. And in practice, that is pretty true. However, when you're looking at it from a financial perspective and you're building a model, you have to have vacancy of at least 5%. That is for risk, to mitigate risk, to say if you had a tenant that was not there for a month, or you had damage to your building and you couldn't have it completely full, that you wouldn't have any financial risk to that. And so we typically use a 5% vacancy to get to your effective gross income. Once you, once you have that, you deduct out your expenses. You have a replacement reserve, and that is for any maintenance costs in the future. You put some money away every year towards that. That gets you to your net operating income. And that tells you how much debt, if any, your building can support. And so then you subtract out your monthly mortgage payment, and that tells you how much money you have left over for things like deferred developer fees and repayment of soft loans. So for cash flow, we assume that your income increases 2.5% and your expenses increase by 3.5%. That's important because that is a safe assumption, and that at some point in the future, your expenses will exceed your income. And what we do when we set up a project is to make sure that that negative point doesn't occur for a really long time. So let's talk about what it costs to do the development itself. There are all kinds of costs, as you know: land, which most of you will own the land; construction costs, all the third-party consultants, surveyors, appraisers, cost estimators, construction managers, all those folks; financing related costs of loan costs, loan fees, loan interest, legal assistance to negotiate all the documents, insurance during construction and taxes, any reserves you need, the holding costs, so if you have to hold land and keep it vacant, and then developer fee. So when we think about funding phases, we have really 3 phases. So pre-development is when you're still looking at your project, and you might get a small loan from an intermediary or use your own money to do things like an initial feasibility from an architect, a cost estimate, maybe a phase 1 environmental analysis of your site. So there's some smaller costs, but they're really critical in determining whether you can move forward. Once you have a real project set up, you're going to work towards getting your construction financing together. So that will be part of, putting together all your local funding, if there's home funds, CDBG funds, local housing trust fund dollars, and then going for your state level larger loans from the multifamily housing program, for example, and then getting a construction loan. So once all that money is in place, you can start construction. Once your construction is complete, then you will pay off your construction loan with your permanent loan, your mortgage loan, and any other sources. So you can think of it as the big fish eating all these little fish, and that is your financing package. So let's talk about pre-development and construction really briefly. So pre-development is all the analysis that you need to do to make sure that your project is feasible and it's supported by, public agencies, your own funds, or pre-development or acquisition loans. So this is small dollars. And once you get to construction to do the work, these are the big dollars, the multi-millions of dollars to pay for the construction of your project. So when we talk about the permanent period, we're talking about repaying that construction loan, to pay that off, to pay yourselves, and to pay into your reserves. And those are usually funded by state level funding, your permanent loan, and for most projects in the state, the low-income housing tax credit equity and state tax credit equity. Operations are when your project is occupied and you have all those operating expenses, and those operations are paid for by rent and any operating subsidy. So what kind of money do we use in affordable housing finance? So you can see that typical market rate housing only has 2 sources of funding: equity and a mortgage, so debt and equity. In affordable housing, we use equity from tax credits, debt from a mortgage loan, and then we have this big gap. So what we use to fill that gap is what makes affordable housing affordable. We use local funding, state funding, other funding that has a lower cost or no cost, and that's what keeps our housing affordable in the long term. Okay, so here are some typical pre-development and construction funders. And, we can talk a little bit about mortgage debt sizing, which is to say, how much money can you support based on the rent that you have? Many affordable housing developments do not have any debt. So I briefly mentioned the low-income housing tax credit, and that is a bipartisan program created in 1986 and consists of two types of tax credits, mostly for corporate investors. Sorry about my front door. So all these sources put together, we look at how much we have left, and then we identify our gap. Gaps are filled with soft sources of debt, as I mentioned, local housing, state programs, and other low-cost housing sources. So when you have soft debt, it means that you don't have to pay it back or only have to pay it back with funding that's left over after you satisfied your debt. And so that's why it's called soft debt. And usually you pay nothing towards it during its 55-year term. But in exchange for this lower cost debt, you're really promising to keep your property affordable for that term. Okay. So in order to take on that kind of soft debt, you have to understand kind of what the criteria are in terms of competitiveness of your project and whether you meet those criteria by population or program. And you understand what you are promising to do in exchange for that money. So I'm going to flash some helpful resources and then I will conclude. So there you go. So I will take your questions at the end, unless Landis, you want to ask me anything now. I know I went really fast.
I'm going to ask one thing as just a bridge over to Caroline. How long? So two things. Why do you think it's a good idea for just whoever's the landowner, and we're assuming right now it's a faith-based ministry, why is it a good idea for them to understand if this project can pencil before they sign on with the developer, not knowing that information? The second question is, how long does it typically take to just accumulate that funding for the gap? Because I don't want people thinking, oh, just wave a magic wand and money's here in 6 months. So those are the two questions, and then we'll transfer over to transfer to Caroline.
Okay, well, thank you. Those are really great questions. One of the reasons that you want to determine whether your project is feasible first is that to get to that next phase is very expensive. Again, when we talked about pre-development and determining feasibility, those are small dollars. Once you start committing towards a bigger project, your architect may do a feasibility analysis for free, for example, or very, quick and dirty back of the envelope just to establish the capacity of your site. That costs very little. When you start to go into drawings, you bring on engineers, you bring on all these other expenses, and it's very hard to stop. You don't want to accrue expenses if your project really can't move forward. So that's why feasibility is really important, to really just have that go, no go question early on. And then kind of the level setting the expectation of, okay, now your project is feasible. Next week you have a project, that hardly ever happens. So from your feasibility analysis to project completion is generally somewhere between 3 and 5 years, partly because it takes a long time to accumulate, as you said, that capital stack. So you're applying for your local funding. And once you get that, you're more competitive. You apply for your state funding. You may have to apply more than once. And then you have your state funding. And then you can apply for your tax credits. And so all of that, because you're talking about funding rounds that are not concurrent, it can take 3 to 5 years to accumulate the capital to start construction, even when you have a feasible project. So thank you for those questions, and I'll hand it over to Caroline.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, for the queue up too. I'm going to share my screen really quick. And hi, everyone. Really grateful to be here. I think this is my second time presenting to this group, bringing a slightly different angle to talk more about the Housing Accelerator Fund. The Housing Accelerator Fund is a community development financial institution. So we fall on that list of lenders that Lisa shared earlier. And we like to think of ourselves as not a typical lender. We were seeded out of the Mayor's Office of Housing in San Francisco, really with the focus of accelerating the production and preservation of affordable homes in San Francisco, an acknowledgement that the city has really aggressive affordable housing goals and obligations under state law, and having a kind of third-party private entity that can work more nimbly and quickly than local government was a key sort of ethos that we embody. And so we started in 2017, again, with this focus on how can we support affordable housing developers and local governments in accelerating the production and preservation of affordable homes. And the way we do that is we pool private and philanthropic and a little bit of public funding upfront to provide financing to primarily nonprofit developers to build their housing from everything from pre-development through sort of permanent financing. That nice list that Lisa went down in terms of the types of financing. We provide that sort of full gamut of financing with the goal of providing the sort of upfront private financing that can move much more quickly, and then sort of a back-end commitment from local public partners to provide a long-term financing plan. This is just a quick snapshot of the projects we've financed to date since 2017. So again, focused in San Francisco, although we just got approval to expand regionally in the last year. But the primary, so we've done 2 loans outside of San Francisco since we expanded. But our home base is San Francisco, and we're really committed to building housing in the city. Just a quick sort of, back end snapshot of where HAF gets our financing from. I mentioned we use a combination of private, philanthropic, and public funding to provide our financing. So you see it's quite a bit of different resources. Again, we were seeded with funding from San Francisco with the focus of helping San Francisco build housing. But since then, we've raised a lot of capital from other private banks, philanthropic organizations, and we are able to use the combination of these sources to revolve into projects. The types of lending that we do, our sort of bread and butter started out as anti-displacement lending in the city of San Francisco. I won't talk a ton about this because I'm not sure how relevant it will be to this group, but we provided bridge loans to nonprofit developers in San Francisco to acquire existing affordable housing, sort of naturally occurring affordable housing, with the goal of putting long-term deed restrictions on that housing and ensuring that they remain affordable for the long term. So that was sort of our foray into working with nonprofit developers in the city. And then from there, we really built out our Housing to End Homelessness Fund. So our sort of flagship project here was our 833 Bryant project. I'll kind of do a quick overview of that one later, but that was a focus on accelerating the production of permanent supportive housing at a lower cost and time horizon. And then lastly, Housing Accelerator Fund I think we really pride ourselves on filling market gaps. And, we're not we wouldn't put ourselves in sort of the traditional wheelhouse of a traditional bank or even some CDFIs that have been around for a long time. We really bring to the projects that we look at of like, how can we fill a market gap and think creatively about, providing financing to the project. And so we focus a lot of our portfolio on research and development and sort of innovative projects. And you see the list here of things we've been trying to unlock and provide financing to in terms of like middle income housing, educator housing, and also faith-based housing, looking at projects and how we can support those. So I talked a little bit about our Housing to End Homelessness. This was our Tehanan project. This is our sort of shining example that we're hoping we can replicate when it comes to permanent sort of supportive housing development. And this was a project, Mercy Housing was the developer on this one, where we provided the upfront private financing in partnership with Tipping Point to provide pre-development, construction, and perm financing to the project kind of upfront. And that allowed us to work with the developer to really hone in on sort of cost and time goals for the project. So we were able to deliver housing in 3 years, which is, to Lisa's point about the general time horizon, much shorter than the typical timeline for development in San Francisco. And then that housing was delivered at 40% lower costs. And part of that was that it was modular housing, and there's lots of lessons learned there. But I think we're really motivated to replicate models that focus on, like, how do we deliver as many affordable homes as quickly as possible, given the significant need in our city. Won't go too much into other examples so we can share, so we can have time for questions, but these are examples of other projects we've worked on, a lot of home key projects, and I talked about the acquisition projects in San Francisco that we worked on. So I think just getting a little more specific about what it would look like to come to the HAF with a financing request. So typically what happens is we would have an initial conversation about your project and what the financing need is. I would guess in many cases it would be the pre-development financing bucket of funding that you would need in terms of doing that sort of upfront, due diligence work, design work. Usually it's in the ballpark of $2 to $3 million that we're providing pre-development loans. And at that point, we need sort of a rough idea of the financing needs. I think if you're new to development and this is your first project, we would definitely want you to be coming in with a development consultant or in some sort of joint venture, just because that's typically the structure we would require if you've never developed housing on your own. And so we would want to see that initial feasibility analysis that you've done, and that project pro forma showing the total development costs, the anticipated public sources, and the rough area median income targeting for the project, as well as the design parameters that you're assuming. And then from there, I think we would kind of drill into that pro forma with you and your development consultant to really test those assumptions that Lisa talked through, both the sort of pre-development budget, the construction sources, and then ultimately the long-term perm financing. And in cases where you're going after public funds like tax credits and bonds, we would want to understand like how this project would score in relation to other projects. And then I think in particular for the vast majority of projects that we're working on, they require a significant commitment of public subsidy in order to pencil. And so we want to know that you've thought through that long-term sort of what we call our takeout plan for our loan, because typically our pre-development loans, again, in the range of $2 to $3 million, and usually around a 3-year term. And that pre-development financing typically is taken out by, or at least a portion of it taken out by a public source of funds or the construction lender. And so understanding that there is a path forward for us to get our loan repaid is a key thing we would go into. And so I think from there, there's sort of this initial look at the project, like this makes sense. It's a feasible project. we have the funding to do it, we've raised the capital for this type of project, then we would issue a term sheet, a draft term sheet to you and your team. And that would be sort of our soft commitment to continue to underwrite the project and look at the project. From there, we would move into sort of the full underwriting process for the loan. And so that's kind of the next level of, okay, looking at your pre-development budget, again, kind of working together to walk through assumptions around the costs in that budget and the schedule for the project. And then, so it's sort of like the project level underwriting. And then as a sort of complementary piece, we're also doing organizational underwriting. And that's when we would work with you to really understand what your what financial resources your organization is backed by. And so we would typically look at 3 years of financial audits and really dig into your income and balance sheet and really think through, you know, what is this organization positioned to take on an affordable housing project, and in particular, pay back our loan, that they have the balance sheet to do that should the project not move forward. So that's kind of a very high level overview of what it would look like to kind of, I think, first chat with us and then get into the actual nitty-gritty of underwriting the project and then your organization. And just a note that, you know, if you're working in partnership with a developer, part of that work, I think part of that sort of organizational underwriting, you would want to talk to your development partner or joint JV partner about, like, you know, who are we underwriting, whose balance sheet are we looking to, because I think we've been flexible in the past where there's like a very new organization partnering with an organization that's more capitalized. We're kind of doing underwriting of both and making an assessment based on that joint project team. Okay. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly touch on a couple of things related to the public funding sources, since you noticed both Lisa and I talked about the sort of crucial piece of having a public commitment for funding projects. And most of our projects, we are relying on some sort of public takeout source. Most frequently, it's the city of San Francisco and kind of getting in their queue for projects. And so I would say, like, having early conversations with your city partners is a really key piece of that. And so just wanted to mention some of the public resources for affordable housing that are either, you know, live or coming down the line that you could look to be that sort of public source, either, you know, for pre-development funding or sort of or perm funding as the gap filler. So if you may be aware that in San Francisco, they passed the Prop A bond for affordable housing. So that was a $300 million affordable housing bond. And you can see here what the sort of breakdown of priorities for that project, for that funding source are. There also was a state bond that passed in March called Prop 1, and this was a behavioral health bond. And a component of that state bond actually is for permanent supportive housing and the capital to build permanent supportive housing. So we're seeing it as a potential source to look to should permanent supportive housing be a goal for your organization. That's a place we could look. And then I think the one that we're all kind of looking to really kind of transform the funding environment is the regional bond, the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, $10 to $20 billion affordable housing bond. That will be on the ballot in November, and this would bring resources to the entire 9-county region. I've kind of put the magnitude on this slide here in terms of resources to build new affordable housing as well as preserve affordable housing. And you can see here in San Francisco, if we have a $10 billion bond, that's 1.2 billion going to the city of San Francisco. And if there's a 20 billion, 2.4 billion, you can kind of see the breakdown by county in terms of new resources to build affordable housing across our region. So I put this here to note that these are kind of resources when you're thinking about sort of the public subsidy and getting public commitment, that these are things we all kind of want to look to in the next, next year to be coming down the line. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. This will be in my slide deck, but it talks more about like what those funds can be used for, which, I think can help as you're thinking through like programming of the development. Those public sources come with guidelines and sort of requirements. And so making sure that there's a match between what the funding sources are and the types of housing that you want to build is really key. And I think I will end there in terms of formal presentation. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Well, thanks, Caroline. I'm going to just ask one tie-in question, and then Michael's going to pull the Q&A together. So one thought I had, I often think about potential, I'm going to call them applicants, if you will. So this is the local ministry that wants to apply for funding. And I know we all know it's very competitive. So I look at it as, jets lined up on the tarmac waiting to take off. Not everyone's in queue, but not everyone's able to take off. What are some of the criteria it's like a two-part question. One is, like, if you have two, let's just say, ministries and they both are ready to go, but maybe one project's much larger, one smaller, and you have to make a decision. You can only take one. What is some of the rule of thumb things that make a site attractive to you, whether it be unit count, less construction complexities, but also do you encourage that maybe they collaborate together? So in other words, there's a collaboration instead of a competition. So when they come, maybe is it beneficial for them to talk as maybe a few of the congregations get together and say, hey, we all want to do housing. Let's work collaboratively. We understand that this project should go first because it's further along or it's larger, but we want to ride the momentum of that. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. In terms of the first part of your question about like which one would be more attractive to us, I think for us, we're focused on, I think innovation and projects that are showing some type of either, construction innovation, a new type of housing. So to my slide earlier, like middle income housing, workforce housing, teacher housing. We're really trying to unlock new housing models. And so I think that's a lens we're always looking for. And then also just, is it feasible? And part of that being like, are the public partners on board with it? I think particularly since we're seated in the mayor's office, we work very closely with them and understanding like, has the development team talked to the city? Is this project in the city's queue? Because in San Francisco, it's a very organized effort around their affordable housing pipeline. And so, we talk to them and they've got like their pipeline set for 5 years already. And so knowing that you've talked to the city, there's sort of the formal NOFA process that the city has, but there's also the sort of informal, the city knows about your project. It's in the sort of priority list. That's another, I think, crucial lens that we're bringing to projects. So I don't think it's like there's an easy answer to that question in terms of like what would we pick one over the other. It's more, I think, understanding feasibility and like commitment to the project from the other sort of long-term partners on it. And then I think we're all for, again, innovation. And if there's if there is a benefit and sort of a collective will to come together to think about sort of a joint financing plan, I think we would dig into that and kind of think through like, oh, is that like a new fund we could raise for faith-based development, and understanding that like SB4 passed and it's a priority for the city and local legislatures, and so I think that's something we would try to think as creatively as possible about. And because we're small and kind of nimble, I think, you know, we're a good place to start in terms of that creative thinking.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was hinting at. I was trying to throw a breadcrumb out there for folks to think about talking to get together. Because if you pull together an aggregate of, let's just say, 10 congregations, and collectively they have a very large aggregate unit count, maybe you will pull a fund together. Even the planning department, which we'll hear from, may say, you know what, we'll put you on a special kind of program as well. And now you're fast tracking faith-based. But thanks for those. I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Landis, you mentioned that we've been working together for a while. I remember, my goodness, Caroline, you mentioned the launch of the Housing Accelerator Fund. Landis and I were on the mayor's balcony when that was launched and had some of the initial conversations with Rebecca when they were building the plane and flying it at the same time. Thank you for what
We're
you
still
did.
doing that, so we're all for innovation.
This is not a shy group. We already have a whole queue of questions. Just a couple I'm hoping that you can start out with that I know are near and dear to congregations. One is averting a nightmare. Okay. How can congregations plan ahead so that they don't get stuck in a quagmire should the project drag out and development costs increase?
Do you want to take that one, Lisa?
Oh, sure. I think the quagmire question is a good one. I think that goes towards sort of having that broader understanding so that a project to take 5 years is not a quagmire. I think that is the norm. So if you are planning to have, you know, money outstanding, that you're putting your own dollars into a project, you have to start out by knowing that it's going to take 5 years and that you're not going to get your money back until the project is complete. And so that changes kind of the mindset of what is a quagmire. And I think that's unfortunately kind of the way things are right now. That is how to avoid causing problems for yourself by understanding that longer term need for your capital.
That is a great answer. Thank you. You know, we had a situation years ago. I have to tell you, our organization tries to stay as far away from politics as possible, but we were called in to support Prop A way back when it was at $260 million. That went to a $310 million bond, and we ended up going out and seeking support because it had a 2/3 threshold that it needed to meet. Well, after all was said and done, and it won, one of the biggest folk that were out there, you know, lobbying for the passage of that, went to apply for that funding and was turned down. And I'm wondering who's responsible. You know, once a bond is passed, who's responsible for making the application? Is that the developer, the financial consultant, or the congregation itself?
Yeah, so typically it would be you'd be coming in with your project team to work on that application. It's usually a notice of funding availability or an RFP that the city would be issuing. Actually, both Lisa and I used to work for the Mayor's Office of Housing. So lots of familiarity with that NOFA RFP process if you want to go deep on that. And you would be submitting that application. And usually most CD wants to have kind of that initial feasibility done. So you've done a rough cut of numbers with CEI or CHPC. You have sort of initial design. It really depends on what stage of the project they're issuing the NOFA for, but say it's for pre-development, they'd want kind of your rough feasibility design and financing, and also understanding who the project team is and what they're bringing. So it would be, usually the developer and sort of joint venture as the lead applicant, but you're working with, your bench of consultants if you have, sort of the funds to do some of that initial like pre-development feasibility work. That's typically who's going in for the application. And then there's a whole scoring process that the city goes through to determine who is ultimately chosen for those awards. I don't know, Lisa, if there's anything you would add about that process.
No, that sounds great.
Well, Lisa, the next question is for you, and it is from Eric Johnson. Will Lisa address what projects require a utility allowance or not?
There, generally, I would say almost all projects have a utility allowance. A utility allowance is an assumption on what utility costs that each tenant will bear in living in the apartment. The only time there isn't a utility allowance is when a building is master metered. For example, that's more typical in special needs housing, maybe the SRO or small studio kind of development for people that are formerly homeless, where all the utilities are paid for by the property owner. And in that case, there's no utility allowance. But a utility allowance is set either by your building systems, and there's a calculation, or by the housing authority, where there's a general assumption of if it's electrical for light, if you're paying for heating your water, if you have air conditioning or heating by electrical or gas. All those assumptions go into a calculation to give you a utility allowance.
Okay, and from Anne Marie Booth, what is the source of rent payments with housing for persons previously homeless and unemployed?
Yeah, so typically you would have for a permanent supportive housing, so that would be like a permanent supportive housing project, and typically you would have an operating subsidy that comes with that. And in San Francisco, at least, it's all that operating subsidy, and this decision making around projects and whether they get that is the Department of Housing and Homelessness and Supportive Housing, HSH. And so those are essential if you're doing PSH. And so it's, I think, often the case, as it was on our Tahannon Street project, where the project is receiving capital dollars to actually build the housing, as well as operating dollars to, be the rent payment for those projects in the case where it's formerly unhoused or homeless populations where there's a long-term operating need to make up that sort of rent payment.
I think this one is also going to Caroline. For the Housing Accelerator Fund pre-development loans of about 2 to 3 million, what kind of interest rates are typical? Are these market interest rates?
Oh, I hate to do a softball on this, but typically CDFIs are under market rate. So from like a private bank, like if you were to go and get a pre-development loan from a JPMC or a Chase Bank, or we're going to be pricing under that because we're a community development financial institution, and our goal is to serve affordable housing. And then I think the other layer there is the types of capital that we are using to fund the loan. So I showed you our balance sheet, and it had a myriad of sources on it. If we're able to raise a fund, that's like, a philanthropic organization wants to do faith-based housing, and they create a $20 million fund, then that sort of 0% interest grant funding would blend down our interest rate. So it'd be kind of toggling between, we're using private bank financing with philanthropic funds to kind of come to a interest rate. So there's not an easy answer, and we really do try to make it work on a per project basis. But yeah, it's sort of what access to capital do we have to be able to make that loan, and at what rate is that coming at? And it obviously helps to have grant funding, philanthropic sources, because then we're able to blend down that rate.
I'm asking these questions in the sequence that they were asked. So Lisa, please don't be upset. I think Caroline has a fan club. Hi, Caroline. This is from Marvin Evans. Are you able to share who the manufacturer was for the modular buildings that deliver roughly 40% in reduced construction costs?
Yeah, we used Factory OS for that project. And there's definitely some learnings on that. So if you want I don't want to like be totally rose colored about, modular. There's definitely, construction issues that came up on that project, but we used Factory OS for that one to answer your question.
From Tyler Stowell, this conversation really underlies the risk involved in doing this kind of development. A strong recommendation to have great owner's rep helping out. So that's sort of an affirmation. Again, from Eric Johnson, any bond resources for Monterey, Santa Cruz, and San Benito counties you know about? I mean, I have to tell you, the people online here, I looked and my goodness, this is a regional audience. So any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I can ask. So the slide that I shared is for the 9-county region, Bay Area region. But I could follow up with whoever the speaker is to kind of get a sense of the bond environment at the local level. But yeah, off the top of my head, no, I don't know the answer in terms of bond funds available. I don't know if Lisa, you have any insight I wouldn't have.
No, but I think it's just to go back to what you mentioned about the statewide bond, it's really important to look at that, the statewide housing bond that may come to the November ballot, because those are resources that will be available statewide.
Jeanette Dinwiddie Moore, you will receive the slide deck of the presenters. As a matter of fact, the recording link will be sent by day's end with accompanying resource links, and this will have a home on this on the San Francisco Interfaith Council website, and you are encouraged to share it with family and friends. From Michelle Kai, what is the approximate pre-development loan size that the Housing Accelerator Fund typically makes, and interest rates?
Yeah, so I spoke a bit to the
interest
rate question. Typical pre-development loan size is 2 to 3 million. I think we've done up to 5 million for larger projects, but yeah, the general range is like in the 2 to 3 million.
Okay, again from Tyler, what avenues to folks who want to build small projects are there? 5 to 20 units does not work in the tax credit environment.
So I think that's a tough one, and I think the half is one of the few funding sources for small site type projects, right? So I'll put it back to Caroline.
Yeah, so there's sort of the small sites that we've done that is more the like existing buildings, acquiring those and stabilizing sort of naturally occurring affordable housing. And then there's we've been looking at middle income housing models and being able to build and finance housing outside of the tax credit system by having like a higher range of incomes, so like up to 140% AMI, and there's like not all sorts of, but there's different financing mechanisms to do that. The one we've been looking at is a joint powers authority, where a local or regional government, like for example, the Bay Area Housing Finance Agency could do this, where they're issuing project-based revenue bonds, so providing kind of low cost bond financing outside of the sort of the usual tax credit market. But our sort of assessment of that model in the current environment is the interest rates are still too high to make that work in this particular moment. But we're pushing it forward and trying to make it work. And I think rates are coming down a little bit. And that helps in terms of making those more middle income or workforce housing models work. And so we're really motivated to work with the new regional finance authority to be that sort of government. It's sort of like a government ownership model. And then you're pairing that with a welfare tax exemption to really kind of get to other types of financing models outside of the sort of deep affordability required with LIHTC. So yeah, if you're interested in kind of that model, would love to talk more about that, because we're really focused on that in the next year of making a workforce housing, middle income housing model work.
We'll ask a few more questions. I'm cognizant of time, but you all have really just kind of sparked everybody's curiosity. Glenn Rogers says San Francisco has a public bank. Is this one of your funding sources?
It is not. And did that legislation pass already? I thought I'd have to look at the status of that. I know there was talks about a public bank, and maybe it'll be up and running shortly. And I think we've been in some of those conversations, but our funding came from the mayor's office. I think it originally was like a portion of a previous bond that seeded us. So not as much of a direct connection to the public bank conversations.
Okay. From Rains Cohen, it sounds like rents are permanently set at 30% of income, means tenants can't really ever save money. And if they are fixed income, they have risk of getting behind and are evicted. Is the 30% rent cap is now a permanent floor?
So the 30% of an area median income is regulatorily set by the funding sources. So for example, when you have low-income housing tax credits in your development, you have a regulatory agreement that runs with the land for 55 years that says you will serve people at these income bands. And so in that way that those rents are set. The income bands, the incomes change year over year. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they could possibly go down, but that keeps that 30% there. So it's really about having a reliable rent that is not tied to a person. If you have, for example, Section 8, that really ties to a person and looks at the income of the person and sets the rent at a percentage of that, 30% of the person's income. So those are two different approaches to setting rents. And I think, rent setting and income building are two different conversations. I think they're really important conversations, but those are two very separate conversations.
Well, we've reached our time, and I will be sharing the chat with our presenters, and time permitting, they'll get back to you. Some great questions. Want to once again thank you for your participation in this third segment of the series entitled The Ministry of Housing. We look forward to reconnecting next week when we will examine the theme, How to Partner with a Developer. We encourage you to help spread the word and invite friends and colleagues to join us. This concludes today's program. Have a blessed rest of your day.